Hello again. Today we're going down a rabbit hole, so to speak, because I've been wondering, why do people turn out the way they do? Now, if you've been following, you will know I spend an unhealthy amount of time chasing dead people through parish registers, censuses, Quaker records, cemeteries, and squinting through online records, trying to work out why every second man in the Hunter family is called Simon. Honestly, if Yorkshire had run out of Simons in the 19th century, I think I know where they all went. I've been wondering how much of who we become is determined by genetics. How much comes from our DNA, and how much comes from our environment? How much comes down to the choices we make through our lives? Because when I look at my own Hunter family, I find a story that raises all sorts of questions. The same bloodlines, the same ancestors, the same DNA, yet generations later, the descendants seem to have ended up in completely different places. One branch produced ministers, schoolmasters, and respected members of the community, albeit a deadbeat husband and father. Another produced farmers, successful businessmen, and a man who murdered his wife and daughter. Or anyone panics, I'm not suggesting there is a murderous gene lurking somewhere in the Hunter family tree, waiting to emerge after 200 years. Although, if there is, I'd appreciate a bit of warning. What I'm saying is that family history gives us a unique opportunity to look at one of the oldest questions in human existence: nature versus nurture, genes versus environment, DNA versus circumstances. So back in the 18th century, there lived a Yorkshire man named Simon Hunter who married the lovely Alice Middlebrook. Simon and Alice were good Quaker people who did what good Quaker people do. They farmed the land and had lots of children while living a modest and Christian lifestyle in Wensleydale, Yorkshire, surrounded by stone walls, sheep pasture, rugged hills and quaint cottages. Amongst their children were two sons. The two boys were born 5 years apart, Matthew in 1782 and Simon in 1787. They grew up in the same family, the same parents, with the same values, same landscape and lifestyle. Now, if DNA is responsible for everything, then their descendants should have turned out much the same. But they didn't. The next generation was Simon and Simon, who were cousins. One born at Your Mill in Aysgarth in 1824, one born in 1827 at Apperset near Hawes. I'm going to call them Simon I and Simon II in reference to who was born first. Simon I's father, named Matthew, was a farmer of 600 acres in Drowton near Skipton in Yorkshire. He left an estate when he died of £1,500, and he included Simon as a beneficiary in his will. Simon II's father, called Simon, was a farmer in Apperset, and he left an estate of £4,000, but he excluded his son Simon from the will, leaving everything to his youngest son Thomas and to two nephews. Simon I became a relieving officer in Skipton. A relieving officer's duties was to act as an investigator for the Board of Guardians, who assessed the needs of the destitute and distributed food, money, or medical aid. They were mandated to keep meticulous records and submit weekly reports to the Board of Guardians. They provided essential items of relief such as bread, flour, and small amounts of cash. One of their duties was to identify the mentally ill and bring them before a magistrate to arrange placement in an asylum. Simon too went on to lose his 166-acre farm and was forced to move around looking for work. First as a shepherd at Killington Hall in Westmoreland for 10 years, then as a labourer in a cotton mill, and finally as a Calvinist minister in Thornton Rust. He spent his entire life reinventing himself. Today, looking at the beautiful handwritten page in the Bible recording the family births, I don't see the writing of a farmer or a labourer. In a day where few people could sign their name, Simon was educated and literate. Perhaps he was never meant to be doing manual work. Perhaps it was thrust upon him until he found his true calling. Simon too produced a large family, and amongst them was a ne'er-do-well son called Matthew. Remember that name. Simon I married Grace in Skipton, and they had a daughter, Elizabeth, and 2 sons, Thomas and Matthew. Remember that name. It seems the Matthews of the Hunter family were the dark characters. And it's interesting that that's where the name Matthew stops, not being carried forward in any other generations. The 2 Matthews were second cousins. Matthew too married the lovely widow Harriet Revell, formerly Davison, gave her 6 more children, and then abandoned her and the children, taking himself across the ocean to Australia, never to return. Matthew I married Alice Maud Harrison. They had 2 children, a daughter Elizabeth and a son called Albert. On a spring afternoon in 1882, a young married couple who had recently moved from Barnsley to Skipton set out for a walk with their 5-year-old daughter. Their route took them behind Skipton Castle and across the fields to Park Hill near the castle woods. What should have been an ordinary family outing ended in horror. For reasons that were never fully understood, the husband suddenly attacked his wife and then turned on their young daughter before finally inflicting a terrible wound upon himself. Hours later, the wife and child were discovered dead. The husband was still alive. A cart was summoned and he was transported to the local workhouse infirmary, where a doctor stitched the wound to his throat and fought to keep him alive. Under constant guard, he remained there while the authorities prepared to bring him before a court to answer for the shocking events that had unfolded on the hillside above Skipton. The tragedy stunned the town and became one of the most disturbing crimes in Skipton's Victorian history. As we dig deeper into the story, an interesting picture begins to emerge. The murders at Park Hill on April 25th, 1882, were not simply a local tragedy. Newspapers across Britain seized upon the story. From Yorkshire to London, shocking headlines appeared as journalists competed to tell the most sensational version of the event. The public could not get enough of it. Every detail was reported, debated, and dissected. But hidden amongst the dramatic newspaper reports are clues that suggest a more complicated story. Witnesses spoke of a man who had not been well. Reports describe severe headaches, confusion, strange behaviour, and what some believe were delusions. Today, we might wonder whether he was suffering from a mental illness or a neurological condition. Whatever the cause, it was clear that something was troubling him in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. There were also the pressures of everyday life. He was struggling at work and finding it increasingly difficult to keep up with the responsibilities. At home, the family had a 7-month-old son. Anyone who has ever cared for an infant knows how exhausting that can be, and Victorian families only had family for support. One detail stands out above all others. On the day of the murder, Matthew wanted to take the baby with them on the walk. The child's aunt, who was living with the family, refused to allow the baby to go. She told him it was sleeping and it should remain at home. So the husband, the wife, and their 5-year-old daughter left the house and made their way towards Park Hill. The baby stayed behind with the aunt. It was a decision that would save his life. The family climbed the hill together, but only one of them would ever return. The deeper I dug into the newspaper archives, the more extraordinary the story became. Victorian newspapers did not hold back. Reporters described the scene in graphic detail. filling column after column with accounts that today would be considered deeply disturbing. Every wound, every torn garment, every blood-stained clue was recorded for a public hungry for answers. Some newspapers seemed more interested in shocking the readers than understanding what had happened. Yet amongst the sensational headlines, a number of intriguing details emerge. 3 local boys reportedly discovered Matthew Hunter still alive. When they approached him, accounts claim that he raised the shoemaker's knife towards them, causing them to retreat in fear and to summon help. When the police and doctors arrived, Matthew was unable to speak because of the severity of his injuries. Matthew was questioned by police. According to reports, when asked who committed the crime, he wrote only 2 words, S. Hunter. That answer has puzzled me ever since. Was he identifying himself as Simon Hunter's son? Was he attempting to blame his father? Was he confused and unable to understand what was being asked? Or was something else entirely going on in his mind? We may never know. Medical evidence presented afterwards suggested that a violent struggle had taken place. Witnesses believed the wife had fought desperately to defend herself. The doctors and their assistants offered differing interpretations of exactly what had happened on the lonely hillside, but they agreed on one thing: there were signs of a struggle. And this is where the story becomes even more complicated. The more evidence that emerged, the less this looked like the actions of a cold, calculating killer. The more it appeared to be the actions of a man whose mind may have been unravelling long before he climbed Park Hill that day. Clearly, a century and a half later, the question remains: what really happened on the hill above Skipton? And what was going through Matthew Hunter's mind when he wrote those mysterious words, S. Hunter? As I read through the reports, I kept finding myself drawn back to one person, Emily Harrison, the sister of Alice, the murdered wife. She had lived for 3 months in their house. She saw the family every day. Of all the witnesses who appeared at the inquest and the court hearings, she was perhaps the only one who knew what life was really like inside the home. Emily knew things that the wider public did not. She knew about the threats Matthew had allegedly made if Alice told her parents what was happening. She knew about the incident at the local public house when concerns became so serious that a publican reportedly escorted Matthew home and removed a knife from him. She knew when the doctors had called. She knew the worries, the conversations, and the tensions that never made the newspaper headlines. Yet what strikes me most is what Emily did not say. She did not appear to speak of Matthew with hatred or bitterness. There were no reports of her portraying him as a cruel or wicked man. Instead, her evidence paints a picture of someone who had become increasingly troubled. One statement in particular stands out. Emily said that Alice would never have left her husband. Emily was the one who perhaps, in a moment of fearful clarity, refused to allow Matthew to take young Albert on the walk that day. In the crowded courtroom, witness after witness spoke of Matthew's previously respectable character and of the deep affection he appeared to hold for his wife. But Emily Harrison's testimony offered clarity. And after hearing the medical evidence from Dr. Russell regarding Matthew's mental state, and I quote, "The prisoner seemed to be suffering from hereditary mania, and that mania might have lain dormant for a generation and then have burst forward without any sufficient cause. He believes it to be the case that persons inflicted with homicidal mania frequently took the lives of those nearest and dearest to them. He should judge the prisoner to be subject to attacks of mania and that he was not at the time he committed the murder responsible for his actions. The jury returned a verdict of not guilty on the grounds of insanity. The decision brought an end to one of Skipton's most shocking tragedies, but not to Matthew's confinement. He was ordered to be detained at Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum. For the families involved, however, the verdict could never undo what had happened at Park Hill on the 25th of April 1882. It would linger in the memory of Skipton for many years to come. One of the most fascinating chapters of Matthew's story began after he arrived at Broadmoor. During his confinement, Matthew wrote numerous letters to his sister. Far from being rambling or incoherent, many of these letters were remarkably articulate, thoughtful and well-structured. They attracted the attention of the medical authorities who chose to study them as part of their ongoing efforts to better understand mental illness. At the time, public opinion of lunatic asylums was often extremely negative. Many people viewed them as bleak institutions where patients were neglected or mistreated. Yet Matthew's letters painted a very different picture. He frequently described Broadmoor in favourable terms, portraying it as a place of care, routine, and comfort rather than punishment. The contrast between public perception and Matthew's own account was so striking that his correspondence was discussed and documented in several medical journals of the period. To Victorian doctors, the letters offered a rare glimpse into the mind of an educated patient living within one of Britain's most famous criminal asylums. Today, those letters remain an important part of Matthew's story, not only because of what they reveal about him, but also because they provide a unique window into the life inside of Broadmoor during the late 19th century. The man who had been declared criminally insane became one of Broadmoor's most articulate correspondents. As the gates of Broadmoor closed behind Matthew Hunter, another story was just beginning, a story of survival, of service, of sacrifice, and a baby boy named Albert, who grew up to be one of Skipton's most loved sons, Albert Hunter, OBE. And that's the story I'm going to tell you in episode 10. But for now, I will leave you with this thought, and I'll see you next time.